Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on the growing gun violence in New York City. As we emerge from the pandemic, shootings are up more than 85% over last year and are close to a 20-year high. As the NYPD continually adapts tactics to stop the bullets from flying, community leaders are stepping up their efforts to bring peace to the streets.
How many kids have to be shot before we take this seriously?
NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea asked that question after a 4-year-old girl and 2 other innocent bystanders were shot and wounded in Times Square on a busy Saturday afternoon. He expressed frustration once again with bail reform laws that allow some of those arrested on gun charges to be automatically released after their arrest with no bail.
We have been taking guns off the street in New York City at an alarming rate over the last 2 years, and it's time now that we have consequences for those.
Increasingly, the shootings involve warring crews or gangs who don't hesitate to fire in crowded public places, like 2 members of the Hoolies gang who were charged with the murder of 1-year-old baby DeVell Gardner Jr. in his stroller. I was given exclusive access to the takedown of the Hoolies to see NYPD's precision policing tactics in action. So we're putting on these bulletproof vests here before we go in to the takedown. The NYPD recommended it, and it's for our safety. I'm wearing one, and so is my cameraman. Supervisors doled out assignments with very specific details. This was not a wide net, massive sweep of years past, but a focused apprehension of the most dangerous trigger pullers capable of firing into a baby stroller.
Think about the impact that ultimately we're making. That's NYPD. That's our teams at its finest.
We're going to see more and more of these cases, in these narrowly focused cases with targeted individuals, and that's going to bring down violence in the city.
We were on scene as the lineup of officers and federal partners, called the Stack, went into 120 Chauncey Street in Brooklyn and emerged with the alleged leader of the Hoolies, Travis Scott, no relation to the rapper. He was one of 18 taken into custody.
I must say, Lisa, this is the city of New York is much safer today. This crew is one of the worst crews that I've ever investigated.
Gun violence is taking too many innocent lives, like Shaheem Lionel McLean. The 21-year-old restaurant worker and aspiring rapper was shot and killed in Brooklyn last fall. His uncle, community leader Tamik Floyd, says it will take a collective effort to bring peace.
There's going to be a lot of shootings. You already can tell the feel of the streets, and it's just troubling.
Everyone agrees it will take unprecedented cooperation to turn this around. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me for this episode, Aisha Sekou. She's the founder and CEO of Street Corner Resources. It's a premier cure violence site in Harlem. She's dedicated her life to uplifting her community, as well as showing young people positive alternatives to violence. Aisha, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. We
really happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Dr. Robert Gonzalez. He's a former assistant commissioner for training with the NYPD and assistant professor of criminal justice at St. John's University, 22 years law enforcement experience. Rob, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Tamik Floyd. He's an outreach coordinator for the Taj Gibson Foundation, and he unfortunately lost his nephew, Shaheem McLean, who was 21 years old, to gun violence last fall. Tamik, our condolences to you and your family over the loss of your nephew, and we thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate you for having me on the show once again, Lisa.
Thank you. Aisha, we look at the gun violence that's already happening. It is up by the high double digits, more than 80% so far this year already over last year. And even taking into account the shutdown, the numbers are shocking. The police commissioner says more guns have come into New York City than ever before. Police officers are taking off more guns off the streets, and yet this violence continues. We've seen children increasingly caught in the crossfire of these shootings, as we did in Times Square, as we saw with a little girl in Harlem on Halloween, as we've seen in other instances where kids have been hit in playgrounds. It's broad daylight. They don't seem to care if the police are around. They don't seem to care if innocent bystanders are around. And those shots are just getting fired. From your viewpoint, what do you see going on?
You know, Lisa, during this whole, what they're calling the pandemic, it's been a lot of violence. And so one of the things that we saw early on in the pandemic was one, we saw a lot of death due to the virus. And I think that, and others would agree, you know, when I talk to folks at the hospital, some of the social workers and psychologists about what's happening with the violence, that a lot of our communities, which were already traumatized and in crisis, and now here comes the pandemic, and then thereby came the loss of life in big numbers. And all of our communities, particularly Black and Latino families, experienced a lot of death. That death in itself, the fear about the virus, also kicks off people's trauma.
Tamik, in terms of your nephew, of Shaheem McLean, may he rest in peace. What can you tell us about what happened to him?
To my knowledge, my nephew, he was an aspiring rapper, and he just got caught up in the mix of, you know, neighborhood beefs. You know, he was trying to do the right thing, you know, but, you know, the streets, you know, got a hold what they do with a lot of young men that's running around in these urban communities. And it's like we need more mentors that's in the community to feed them some positivity, because everything they get is negative, you know, and they really are afraid, you know, to express their feelings. Like, I wish I had more time to really, you know, sit down and build with him, you know, because I was doing my work with the foundation and helping others, and it's and I start to feel like I neglected him in sort of way, because I should have been more focused on him, you know. So it was just a sad situation.
No, it is a sad situation, and you can't blame yourself, because you're doing everything that you possibly can to try to deal with this problem. And in my opinion, the one that should be blamed is that person that pulled the trigger. That's the person ultimately that should be blamed. Dr. Robert Gonzalez, you've been in law enforcement for more than 20 years. So you know this whole cycle that we see ourselves going through right now. It seems familiar to some in law enforcement. Police Commissioner Shea says that we are near a 20-year high for shootings. For 3 years, the NYPD got shootings way down, they got murders way down, and then now we're seeing this skyrocketing. Give us your view of where we're at now and why this is happening.
Well, as a result of bail reform, there are individuals who are being arrested for gun violence and then being let out to actually reoffend again. So until we look at bail reform, we might continue to see these issues. In addition to the disbandment of anti-crime teams in a local precincts, what should have happened is there should have been better supervision and better training for these anti-crime officers in lieu of just getting rid of the entire unit. So again, we need to look at what was being done in the 90s, some of the quality of life offenses with broken windows that helped to clean up our streets in transit and also in our cities. We saw in Times Square just past this week where 3 people were shot in the middle of Times Square. So if you're not safe in Times Square, you're definitely not going to be safe in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where these incidents took place, where we lost a 22-month-old as a result of a stray bullet. So unless we go back to the basics in law enforcement, go back to broken windows, quality of life offenses, and go after the gun violence and the gun holders, we're going to continue to see this violence throughout the summer. Based on what you said, it looks like the summer is not going to be bright for some individuals unless we go back and start tackling these incidences with gun violence.
So what will it take to stop the shootings? That's next. Stay with us.
Aisha, let me give you a chance to respond. So Dr. Robert Gonzalez says this is about bail reform. We've seen some incidents where the people are not they're being accused of shooting a gun, they get arrested, and then they're right back out on the streets participating in the rest of whatever the beef was that got them started shooting in the first place. Do you think that's a valid concern in this, or a valid piece of this, or not?
I don't want to attribute, and I'm not in agreement with attributing the increase of violence to bail reform. I think that the increase of violence is the lack of oversight or management of those that have been released. And so we saw that even before the pandemic, that those people that were being released were released with no provision of oversight. So that's one thing. We have to look at those people who manage people who are reentering are already overworked. And I don't think that the reform and the people who manage them is equal. Like the officers, probation and parole officers have a heavy caseload already, and now you have people being released, and who's managing those people? So we saw people go back to criminality because they were not being provided oversight. I think the other thing is, and that's a place where the city needs to assess and make some adjustments. But I think also uptick in violence, like I said, had a lot to do with people being homeless and not having an economic crisis. And we just saw people actually panicking, and that bail reform, and not just bail reform, because they cleansed the jails, so to speak. They let out people to try to thin the population, but they again did not provide the kind of oversight,
no reentry, no
no
reentry.
reentry support,
Tamik,
almost none.
Tamik, what's your take on that? When you look at what's going, you're out there on those streets every single day, in Brooklyn especially. What do you think is contributing? What do you think are the main points of what's contributing to this violence?
I would say lack of intervention programs and lack of accountability on both parts from law enforcement and the community. You have individuals that's policing these communities that's not from these communities, that don't understand the people that's from, so that's the disconnect right there. And on the other side, you have people from the community that don't want to connect and communicate with law enforcement, other problems. So it's like, it's basically accountability. We have to hold ourselves accountable to be productive citizens. Unfortunately, I was formerly incarcerated, and I do not agree with that, the bail reform, because you have individuals that committed crimes and really changed their life, so I'm not solely, I'm just one of many individuals who, did something that wasn't right and paid it to society, and now out here and trying to change the narrative. I am changing the narrative,
You are changing the narrative, and you're also telling people, look, this is how we interact with police in a positive way, to have them do what we need them to do in our communities, which is arrest people that are hurting other people, stealing their property, causing mayhem and stress in the neighborhood, and not bother people that are not doing anything. Dr. Robert Gonzalez, the issue, and we've interviewed you previously about this, but there's been a combination, kind of like a perfect storm of factors in terms of the gun violence situation in New York. We had the courts closed for a long time, so no grand juries doing any indictments. We had a lot of economic issues, people a lot easier to run guns in some cases, take a drive down south or wherever and drive back to New York, than it is to deal with drug dealing when people had no money. And then also just that overall tension and desperation that has been in the air for over the year. What do you think about those factors?
Well, again, we have to remember that law enforcement was dealing with COVID, both with the public and also within the agency. They lost a lot of officers that went out sick. So there was less police officers out on the street to enforce the regulations in our communities. But I just want to make something very clear. When I speak about bail reform, I speak about those issues that are releasing hardened criminals, individuals who are out there possessing firearms and shooting one another. Those are the individuals, and those are the areas of bail reform that I think need to be looked at. I'm not talking about the hardworking mother or father who cannot afford bail as a result of being arrested for, let's say, a domestic dispute or even a minor larceny in that case. I'm talking about the hardened violent criminals who are out on bail to offend and reoffend and then offend again.
Tamik, what's your sense about the vibe on the streets right now?
It's going to be a wild summer. It's sad to say, but we have to remember how we got to this point. That's why there's so many restrictions according to policing. There was a lot of neglect, a lot of discrimination, prejudice, bigotry through the years. And I'm not anti-police at all. I'm just reliving the things that I seen growing up when I, high school basketball player, and being, subjected to some discriminating behavior because of the neighborhood I live in. I'm from a housing development, so I come out in my building, I may see 3-4 drug dealers. 2 of the drug dealers are my childhood friends, so I'm not supposed to speak to them. So there's a lot of things that has to be changed within, and so moving forward, I do agree with, them having the takedowns, but targeting the ones who need to be targeted, because everybody from these housing developments, they're not criminals. It's not their fault that they live in, their low income.
Exactly. Your zip code shouldn't automatically mean you're a suspect. Dr. Robert Gonzalez, how different is this approach from what's been used in the past? Because the other thing I saw on the raid was when what they call the stack, which was the officers and the federal partners, they're going into the building, in the past, when I was in some of the the raids that they had in Harlem, like 4 or 5 years ago, they would just go in and then they would be out within a matter of maybe 10 minutes or so. They went in, the entire group went in, they did come out for over half an hour. And then I asked the commander afterwards, I go, what was the delay? If he was the only one that was in the apartment, what was the delay with that? And the commanding officer told me, he goes, Lisa, he goes, we have an entire set of protocols that we have to do before we can even think about kicking that door down. This is not like kicking down doors and grabbing people outside and kids screaming and innocent people, innocent people being dragged in. So they went through the whole protocol. They took in these gang members, 18 of them, all pre-indicted, all on arrest warrants, not just based on a suspicion. And they said that there's going to be many more of these coming up because they have these cases that they've been building. And now that the courts are open, we're going to be seeing more of that. And they hope that's going to work. But Dr. Robert Gonzalez, in terms of the difference, is this progress in terms of a climate now where we're so aware and really trying to avoid the injustices of the past?
Oh, absolutely. They're engaging more on precision policing. They're doing better intelligence gathering with their community partners so that they don't knock on the wrong door. We saw with Breonna Taylor what could happen, right, in the event that law enforcement is a little over aggressive in executing a warrant. So now they're doing adequate intel. They're speaking to the community. They're taking their time because they don't want to kick down the wrong door. They don't want to go in when there's children home or maybe non-participants or whatever criminalities individuals are being arrested for. They're getting away from throwing just a net over an entire community, and they're doing more precision-based intelligence gathering so that they avoid, arresting individuals who should not be arrested as a result of, like Mr. Meek said, leaving his building and just saying hello to a drug dealer doesn't mean that when the police officers go into that particular community and sweep everybody, that everybody should be arrested.
Right.
The people that should be arrested are the ones that are engaged in criminality.
Aisha, what about the relationship with the police?
We've been working really, I would say we've been working diligently to increase the relationship with the police and the community. Why? Because I know if somebody's coming through my window or trying to, jiggle my door, I'm going to call the police.
Right.
And so I also know that over years, I have a grown daughter, and over the years of her growing up, even to her disagreement, those officers, I could name them, to be able to have the relationships on not just a first name basis, but real relationships where I could say, as a mother in the neighborhood, if you see my daughter, you make sure you tell her to get in here if it's getting ready to get dark. And they would do that. We need to know the officers in our community. They need to know us. It doesn't need to be through a criminal type lens. I think when people know each other in the community, we develop better relationships.
Tamik, what do you think about that? Like how easy it is to get a gun in New York right now?
This is crazy. I mean, you'll find a gun before you'll find a book in our communities. It's crazy. I think, but there's a lot of politics behind the scenes. They need to just take the politics out of it and care about human beings, because at the end of the day, the human beings is the ones that's losing their lives. You have mothers. My sister, example, lost her baby, her oldest kid, and it's because there's too many politics bickering on their own agendas and just not say, this is supposed to be a human thing and let's save these lives, because the gun violence is rapid in urban communities. So it seems like you don't really care. If it was happening in suburbia, would it be more of an issue to cure the gun violence?
And then what kind of an impact, just give us a sense from the family perspective, if you don't mind, for your sister losing her son like that?
It's tough because I don't really know what to say to her. She lost her kid, so it's like, and he was the oldest of her children. And it's just, I go to her house, she has like a little memorial of him. He'll say he liked to rap. So she made a little memorial with his favorite pair of shoes, which was McQueen's and and a microphone, that he used to rap with in the studio. So it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see, how much he has grown in short little time. He was honed in his skills to be a MC, and it was like something that he really was adamant about. He was working at Applebee's Olive Garden at the time of his murder, and it was just her. It's like I've seen a lot growing up, unfortunately, living in the housing developments. But, when it hits home like that, and to see how, she's very strong, But, you know, it's hurtful. You know, it's really hurtful to see my sister go through that pain.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on Gun Violence. You can watch it again and share it on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page. I'm Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind, it's your best weapon. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.